Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What is your family's darkest secret? Was there a deathbed confession? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. After my grandfather on my mother's side passed away, my mom, her sister, and my two uncles pieced together a bit of family history wherein they came to the conclusion my grandfather murdered a child molester who was eyeing my aunt, who was the baby of the family at the time, only 6 or 7, on school grounds, and trying to get her into his car on multiple occasions. My grandfather drove her to school one day, it was a Friday, and asked her to point out the man who'd been doing this. She did, and that weekend, Grandpa and a close family friend had organized a little getaway for the family, up the coast, to the beach, which was very random. At a rest stop for gas and snacks, my uncles, 8 and 10 and 11, saw a bundle under their seat in the back, and when they unrolled it, they found a machete covered in viscera. My younger uncle didn't understand what he was seeing, but the older one knew it was some dangerous adult business and wrapped it back up, made him swear not to say anything. They get to the beach late Saturday, and before anyone gets out, Grandpa and the family friend have to do something first, and they grab a big corporate roll out of the trunk, grab the bundle from under the seat, and carry it up the shoreline past the rocks and such. A while later, they came back, took the family to a hotel for the night, and spent most of Sunday having fun at the beach. As adults now, my mom and her siblings were shocked, each contributing some small piece to this whole story, never knowing about the whole thing until then. Finally, my grandmother chimed in and said that Grandpa was not a man who trusted the police to do anything about anything, and just shrugged. I only really feel comfortable telling this now, as both grandparents, my aunt, and my mom have all passed away. Only my uncles are still kicking. My grandmother's birthday was on October 30th. When she died, we learned it was actually on October 31st. She refused to acknowledge that she was born on Halloween. My dad learned as an adult that his father, who he'd known as his dad his entire life, was not his biological father, but that's not the crazy part. After my grandmother died, my dad asked me to see if I could find anything out about his biological father online. Popped a few details into Ancestry, and very quickly found a marriage certificate showing a marriage that happened before my grandfather. Then I found another. Then another. My grandmother had been married not once before, but 3 times before she eventually married my grandfather, and she'd kept them all secret. We don't even think my grandfather knew about the first 2. This was all in the 40s, spanning several states, and we weren't able to find divorce paperwork for all of them. So it's quite possible she was legally married to several people. I had an aunt on my dad's side who became severely cognitively impaired as a child, supposedly due to a mosquito bite. She was placed in a care facility and no one ever seemed to visit her or acknowledge her. I think my mom did once give my grandmother a ride there to let her visit once. She actually passed away shortly after my grandparents died of natural causes. My dad used to take me to an old veterans bar when I was a kid. Some of the other members would bring their kids or grandkids as well, and I would play with one of them in particular because my dad always talked to his mom. One day my dad got pretty hammered there and pulled me to the side. He leaned in and pointed to the kid. He said to me that other kid was my brother. I asked what he meant, and he seemed to realize he shouldn't have said anything and said he just was. This was 20-something odd years ago. I'm pretty sure my mom knows my dad cheated, but not the extent of having another kid. I also don't think he remembers telling me. I know nothing about that kid and couldn't even recall his name. My parents are also currently the happiest I've ever seen them recently, and I don't want to bring up anything to stop that because they had some rough years. So for the time being, the only other person that knows is my wife and Reddit. We were going through photo albums from my grandfather's obituary, and we found some pictures of my mom in a wedding dress. That should have been the first red flag. My mother has described her wedding dress to me in details before. My mom told them to close the album and look through the others, but she refused to tell me why. She said she would tell me after we got back to where we lived. When we did, I will never forget the words that left her mouth. Those pictures were from my first marriage. Don't tell your brother. My paternal great-great-grandfather paid for my great-grandmother and her family to be murdered so he could take the kids. My grandpa and his 3 sisters. He came from a wealthy family and my great-grandmother didn't, so it turned into basically a blood war to kidnap the children. Well, it turns out the man my great-great-grandfather paid was a friend of my great-grandmother and her family, and told them about the plans to have them murdered and take the children. So they were able to leave overnight and escape without a trace. They went into hiding until my great-great-grandfather died, and they were finally able to reunite with my great-grandfather. But by this time the kids were older and had little to no relationship with him, and the relationship they did have was incredibly hostile. My grandpa moved to the United States when he was an early teenager with his sisters and my great-grandma, primarily to get away from my great-grandpa, but that didn't really work, since he ended up following them. My dad and his siblings ended up having a relationship with my great-grandpa that wasn't well received by my grandpa, but great-grandpa insisted. Despite everything, my great-grandpa never had any other kids and left all of the family money, land, etc. to my grandpa, being the only son. My grandpa didn't want anything to do with it and sold it off. We're like 99% short of the cartel in Mexico because the deal was crazy shady, and we were pretty sure the land was already being used as a cover for the cartel anyway. Grandpa also is very hush-hush about how he has had so much wealth in his life. I'm sure he'll take that to his deathbed. My mom's parents died when she was around 3. She and her siblings were split up. The oldest was adopted by a family, the middle was adopted by their uncle and his wife, and my mom was fostered by an Amish family. Eventually, the uncle and his wife adopted my mom as well a few years later. My mom had my brother at 16 and me at 19. As a kid, I can remember her uncle, who we refused or referred to as our grandfather, visiting us weekly, although he and his wife lived 40 minutes away. He only visited when my stepdad was at work, and we would always be ushered outside and the door would be locked. Many years later, when we were adults, my brother got into a fistfight with our uncle, who was the son of our grandfather. It happened because he revealed that our grandfather was actually my brother's father. Suddenly, so many things made sense in my head. I cut that entire side of my family and my life. I've never asked my mom about it. I had a great-great-aunt that was a widow 3 separate times. Everyone said it was super sad and unfortunate, and that she stopped marrying in fear that it would happen again. But when she died, one of our family members looked more into the deaths of her husbands. They found it strange that all of them died from natural causes, despite them being too young to have them. It's not like natural causes can't happen at 30 to 40, but it's strange that it was 3 separate times. The more they investigated, the more they started to realize that all of these deaths weren't accidental. I can't remember how they figured it out, but we learned that she had poisoned all of them and nobody knew. She had played innocent the entire time, and she was never looked into because nobody thought the deaths were homicide. So now everyone knows her in my family as a Black Widow, and it's easily the darkest secret we have. We have another secret, but it's less dark and crazier, and I can't share it, lol. My family used to be pretty prestigious. They only married within certain noble families. Unfortunately, that led to a lot of poor health in the descendants, and eventually my great-grandfather and grandfather realized we were too sickly and ugly. So for the future of the family, he started adopting a lot of children who looked healthy and good-looking, passing them off as the children of his wives and mistresses. They would straight up go to parents and ask for their kids, and a lot of the time the parents handed them over because they thought they could be provided a better life. He also adopted the kids of people who tried to kill him, and thought it was funny that the kids of his enemy would grow up loving him. My dad told me this when I asked why nobody wanted to get genetic testing to narrow down what caused the family blindness. Turns out, they are all worried the tests would prove they aren't related to me, when it's obvious due to my health issues, my lineage is without question. So I got the ugly, inbred blue blood genes. When she was dying, my great-grandmother confessed to my grandmother that she was the reason great-grandpa died at 48 years old. The doctor blamed it on a heart attack brought on by heat stroke and the malaria he'd contracted as a younger man. Great-grandma says that the morning of his heart attack, he'd been snippy with her, so she put rat poison in his coffee cup. She thought better of it and dumped it out before serving him coffee that morning, but she didn't wash it out, and, well, it doesn't take a whole lot of arsenic to kill a man that's already got malaria. Oof. I just learned this in December. During World War II, my great-grandfather, who died before I was born, likely helped Nazis land successfully in Florida. He was put on trial for it, but was never convicted because they didn't have enough evidence. Apparently, my whole family is 100% sure he did it. He sent my grandpa, his son, to Germany as a teen to attend a military school there, no doubt hoping that my grandpa would come back with different beliefs. He even met Hitler once when he was in training there. He came back to the US after only a few months because he didn't like it. My grandpa fought in World War II on the US side and was also put on trial for being a potential spy during his time in the German training camp, but thankfully wasn't convicted because he was innocent. Kind of a wild thing to know that if he had been wrongly convicted, I wouldn't exist. My dad hit someone walking on the side of the road during a snowstorm and didn't kill them, but I think injured them pretty significantly. I know the details, but he made payments to this woman monthly for a long time. He's dead now, and I'm no contact with his wife. My husband and I could never find anything about an arrest or court case, so I'm assuming it was blackmail, because my dad wasn't a nice enough person to do it out of guilt. Not sure about a deathbed confession, but if I see him I want to ask my great-grandmother lived until she was 99. I never met her, since she was an extremely rotten whore, as Mom called her whenever she was mentioned. My grandfather hadn't talked to her or any of his brothers or sisters in over 30 years. One day, one of them found his Facebook and DM'd him, saying their mother was dying and if he wanted to go to the funeral. He didn't and asked for her phone number. According to family, we barely deal with anymore, and for whatever reason his ex-wife, my grandmother, still talks to, there was a 2-minute phone call between him and her. I want to know what he said. My dad accidentally or unintentionally fathered dozens to hundreds of surrogate children. He was deployed overseas in the US Air Force when his wife at the time just went nuts and left my 2 older brothers by themselves and abandoned them. She was not paying bills, and my dad had to make up extra money to survive. And luck has it that his neighbor at the time was a nurse at a fertility clinic. He only donated for long enough to make ends meet, but unknown to him, the profile of him being a US Air Force captain, a Mensa member, several college degrees, and good-looking, a lot of couples chose his samples. So far, only one of my surrogate siblings has reached out, but my father passed away over a decade ago. My piece of uncle actually sent my mom a cease and desist letter, using his own law firm's letterhead, to never speak of this to my grandma, because it deeply upset her to learn her son donated to a sperm bank, and he bore children outside of wedlock. She's now a big part of our family, and I'm actually going to meet her for the first time tomorrow. Honestly, I hope to someday meet more of my surrogate brothers and sisters. A lot of them may never know or even care, but I think it's kind of crazy and cool. I know someone who also had donated and is a father to, that I know of, like 8 or 9 people. He's older and actually was, well, anyway, I don't want to give any more away. Not in my family, but one of my very close friends is one of those children. Interesting. I recently learned that Grandpa, who served in World War II, received a Purple Heart on the European front and may have been a U.S. interrogator on U.S. soil. He spoke fluent German, and when he came back from Europe due to injuries, he served as an interrogator somewhere on the East Coast. It was all top secret, and I can't find info on it. I can't remember what the type of his unit was called. Something East Coast area boys. Obviously, it's not a dark secret, but it proves Grandpa could hold one. If you really need a secret, the same Grandpa got drunk at a family party and exposed his racism. Shit old people say. I thought it was weird because my mom was not raised as a racist, and it shocked her also. My mom's dad died when she was a young teenager in a workplace accident when he fell into a press. She was the one who identified his remains as her mother couldn't be found. She was an only child, and his death fractured the family, and she basically herself from then on. About 40 years later, I accompanied her back to say goodbye to her estranged uncle, who was on his deathbed. He told her that him and her father were spies for the government, and he had been killed in the line of duty, and they'd staged the death. They'd had her identity, the body, because her mother would have asked too many questions. He may have been senile, but he didn't seem lucid, and my mom said it would explain a lot of other things. When I was 13, I came home drunk and went straight to my mom's journal for a reason that eludes me to this day, and I read she wished my dad would cheat on her so she had a reason to leave. I lived with that for 8 years, where finally my sister told me, when drinking, that she had caught our dad cheating on our mom when I was around 14. But she never told our mom or anyone, only confronted our dad to stop the affair, as she knew our mom would take us away from him. I then told her about their diary. We have never really spoken about it since. It's been another 8 years. When my white grandmother was in elementary school in Alabama, she would walk home from school alongside her 3 friends. They would titter and gossip the whole way down the country dirt road. I don't know what age they were, I'm guessing around 3rd or 4th grade. The janitor of the school was a very jovial black man. He would often joke and wave to the children as he did his job in the school, and the kids always loved him. One day, on their usual walk home from school, a janitor jumped out from a bush and said, "Boo!" The 4 girls screamed in happy excitement and ran all the way home. When my grandmother ran into the house, her grandfather was there, immediately asking why she had run home instead of walking, as she usually did. My grandmother said something to the effect of, "Janitor so-and-so scared us on our way home." Her grandfather took this to mean something rather more serious than it actually was. My grandmother says that he left immediately, and he didn't get back until dinner. Nothing about it was discussed. The next few school days, the janitor was absent. Finally, a week or 2 later, he was back on the job. He now had a permanent limp. My grandmother said that she never saw him smile at the kids ever again. My grandmother dated a federally watched wanted drug lord. In her late 60s, she dated Bud. He was a large guy who bragged about being in Jimmy Hoffa's crew the day he disappeared. My grandmother is retired, living on a pension, nothing special, and starts dating this guy in Waveland, Mississippi. One day, she walks in and sees him standing there with this open suitcase of cocaine or heroin or something, and he just beats the shit out of her and puts her in the hospital. When my mom and her sister and my dad go to the locals, They don't know his actual name, but know his address, and he's Bud. Local police look up a few things to figure out who this is, and they describe him based on the info on the screen, and within a few minutes a supervisor comes in, saying they can't be there and can't be talking about this guy, but the initial officer is shocked someone like this is in their jurisdiction. Dad works with a retired Secret Service agent and asks if he can make a phone call to find out who this guy is and what he's up to. 2 days later, a pair of FBI agents walk into my dad's office to ask why he's asking about Bud. They tell Dad not to involve himself or pursue it any longer. Bud died about 2 years later, grandmother 3 years later. We still don't know who he was or what the scope of what was going on around us. Not my direct family, but my wife's. And this is in no way comparable to the gut-wrenching other stories in here. I just found my wife's grandmother's story interesting. He confessed to him and another fella killing a revenuer back in the 40s. I have no proof of that, other than the few folks that were with him when he passed. He was a wild man growing up, in fights constantly, took up boxing so he could hurt them quicker, got pissed off when the government required driver's licenses, made moonshine, which leads to the revenuer coming up missing. The man eventually turned his life over to God and became a preacher. 2 different men from what I am told. One was a crazy lunatic, the other was a nice, sweet, humble man. I never got to meet him before I met my wife. He passed in the late 90s. When his confession gets brought up, her family says, yeah, that was Joe's crazy days. Not one of them was surprised when they heard it. Mom and Dad did the genetic match thing. I don't know if it was all 23andMe or one of the others. Years later, my mom got an email out of the blue. A young woman said she'd grown up in foster care after having never known her dad and being taken from her drug-addicted mom. She was now happily married with 2 daughters of her own and wanted to find her dad, so she did the same service and got a near match in my mom. I don't recall the details, but basically her dad had to be a nephew of my mom or something close to that. Well, there was only one male in my mom's family that was the right age. Deciding that it wasn't her secret to keep, my mom told the woman about her nephew, my cousin. Turns out that while he was engaged to his current wife, he'd been banging this other woman. It eventually came out that he had known he'd gotten her pregnant. It wasn't a one-night stand, and had immediately bailed. He refuses to this day to acknowledge her. His wife stood by him. But the real kicker? About a year after the revelation, the cousin's daughter got married. My dad had just started to get sick, so he and my mom couldn't come. So I flew from California to Ohio, and my sister flew from Maryland to attend and represent our family. You know how traditionally you invite out-of-town relatives to attend things like rehearsal dinner? Yeah, we were basically persona non grata because my dear cousin and his wife were absolutely terrified we'd reveal their big secret, which they were keeping from their kids. They were dead wrong. We'd both agreed that we weren't going to be those kinds of assholes who ruin the other person's wedding. But he, of course, there couldn't be an actual discussion about it. Fast forward another few years, and the daughter who had gotten married calls my mom. She and my mom had always been close, but she was absolutely livid because she had just found out about this other person out there claiming to be her half-sister, and that my mom had apparently been the one to start the rumors about her dad. Of course, what wasn't really happening is that she'd learned the truth. But to this day, this call was now 4 or 5 years ago, she hasn't spoken to my mom again. And The real surprising / not surprising bit, the cousin, the dad in all of this, is the most virulently racist person I know. I'm sure it'll shock you to learn that a white guy who grew up in suburban Columbus, Ohio, could have possibly turned out that way. But if you're following along, you already know the punchline the daughter he refuses to acknowledge is black. The good news is that I got a very cool new family member out of this. She's awesome, way better than any of the other kids or my cousin had a hand in raising. And she has a daughter who is precisely, to the day, the same age as my son. Only last year I found out that my grandpa wasn't my biological grandpa. It turns out that when my grandma was 18, she was dating a man in his 30s who got her pregnant with my mom. Upon finding out she was pregnant, he left her for a 13-year-old. After delivering my mom, my grandma apparently tried to kill herself by sticking her hand in an oven. For whatever reason, that didn't work. The man that I knew to be my grandpa, I never actually really knew him. He died when I was 3, was a pen pal in the army, also in his 30s, who stepped up to marry my grandma and adopt my mom when she was an infant. My grandma ended up divorcing him in her 30s and entering a relationship with a guy in his 60s. That guy apparently regularly SA'd my mom when she was younger. Safe to say that my grandma had a bit of age gap and terrible taste in men. Growing up, I always felt like there was something off about my family. Conversations would suddenly stop when I walked into the room. My grandmother would start to say something only for my mom to shut it down with a sharp look. I figured it was just normal family drama until my great-uncle's deathbed confession changed everything. He was in hospice, barely conscious most of the time, but when I visited, he grabbed my wrist out of nowhere. His grip was weak but urgent. His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't kill him. I just froze. I had no idea what he was talking about. His eyes were watery, but he held my gaze. I never told your grandmother. She would have never forgiven me. I asked him what he meant, but he was slipping in and out of it. Eventually, he mumbled something like, "We were just kids," before closing his eyes. He never woke up again. After the funeral, I asked my mom if she knew anything. She went pale, then she sighed like she had been holding something in for years. Apparently, when my great-uncle was a teenager, he and his older brother, my grandmother's brother, went to swimming in a lake near their childhood home. They were messing around, shoving each other, when something went wrong. My great-uncle pushed him too hard, and he hit his head on a rock beneath the water. He went under and never came back up. The family always said it was just a tragic drowning. No one ever questioned it. My great-uncle had lived his whole life carrying the guilt, never telling a soul. I don't know if it was really an accident or it was really, in some heated moment, it was something worse. All I know is that he took the truth to his grave, and now I'm the only one who knows.